Welcome back, guys. We will be reading the third material on Three Guineas by Virginia Woolf. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so the name of the article is The Past, the Present, and the Lessons of History. Virginia Woolf's Feminist Historiographical Method in Three Guineas by Jane D. Gay. So, the past, the present, and the lessons of history, Virginia Woolf's Feminist Historiographical Method in Three Guineas by Jane D. Gay. Okay, so what does this article do? This article explains how Virginia Woolf writes history in Three Guineas and why her way of writing history is feminist. Jane D. Gay argues that Woolf does not write history as a straight line of progress. She writes history by connecting the past and the present to show that women's oppression has hardly changed over centuries and that this failure of progress helps explain war and fascism. Jane D. Gay argues that Woolf does not write history as a straight line of progress. She writes history by connecting the past and the present to show that women's oppression has hardly changed over centuries and that this failure of progress helps explain war and fascism. Women's oppression hardly changed over centuries and that this failure of progress helps explain war and fascism. So the article answers three big questions. How does Woolf understand history? How does she write history differently? And why is this method feminist and political? How does Woolf understand history? How does she write history differently? And why is this method feminist and political? Okay. Woolf's basic view of history. 2.1. Point number 2.1. Rejection of history as progress. Traditional history inspired by the Whig. So the Whig history claims society improves over time. Each century is better than the last. Institution brings progress. Woolf rejects this completely. She believes human behavior repeats itself. Power structures remain the same. Women's position barely improves. Jane D. Gay shows that Woolf's belief history shows sameness rather than difference across time. Rejection of history again. Rejection of history as progress. Traditional Whig history claims society improves over time. Each century is better than the last and institutions bring progress. So traditional Whig history claim korche society improves over time. Each century is better than the last one. Institutions bring progress. Woolf rejects this completely. She believes human behavior repeats itself. Okay, power structure remains the same and women's position barely improves. Okay, puro tinte claim ke nakar kore dicche that society improves over time, each century is better than the last, and power institutions bring progress. মানে ইনস্টিটিউশনের হাত ধরে প্রগ্রেস আসে. Traditional history claim করছে society improves over time, institutions bring change, each century is better than the last. Woolf rejects this completely. She believes human behavior repeat itself, power structures remain the same, and women's position barely improves. Jane D. Gay shows that Woolf believed that history shows sameness rather than difference across time. Point number 2.2. Explain examples from Woolf's Agekar writing. Jane D. Gay proves that this is not new to Three Guineas. She shows that Woolf expressed the same ideas earlier. The Journal of Mistress Joan Martin, published in 1906, a 15th century woman says people today are much the same as long ago. Modern fiction, Woolf says literature moves in circles, not straight lines. Between the acts 1941 and Woolf suggests historical periods are costumes, not real breaks. These examples prove Korche that Woolf never believed in steady progress. Woolf never believed in steady progress. Okay. A traditional Whig history claim Korche that society improves over time. Each century is better than the last. And it is institutions which bring changes or progress. ठीक है, institutions bring progress. She believes human behavior repeats itself, power structures remain the same, and women's position does not improve, barely improve. Woolf never believed in steady progress. Point number 3, ordinary people, not great men. Traditional history jeta, Whig history jeta, focuses on Raja, Maharaja, states, wars, laws, famous men. Woolf rejects this. She believes history lives in ordinary people, especially in women's private lives, especially inside families and homes. Jane Digge explains that Woolf focuses on daughters, mothers, sisters, wives. This is feminist because women are excluded from public institutions, so their history exists in private space. And Woolf, by talking about the private history, is definitely a feminist move. Cano? Traditional history focuses on kings, states, wars, laws, famous men. Woolf rejects. She believes history lives in ordinary people, especially in women's private lives, especially inside families and homes. Jane Digge explains that Woolf focuses on daughters, mothers, sisters, wives. This is feminist because women were excluded from public institutions, so their history exists in private spaces. Because women were excluded from public institutions, their history exists in public spaces. And again we are continuing. Point number 4, blurring history and fiction. Timer on karachi. Let's just see. Yes guys, I have. Point number 4, blurring history and fiction. Woolf does not separate history and fiction. Okay. Jane Digge এটাকে explain করছে. Woolf uses fictional techniques to write history. Woolf uses history to deepen fiction. মানে introduce করছে. Woolf uses fictional techniques to write history. Woolf uses history to deepen fiction. This happens in short stories, novels, essays, memoirs. Key idea হচ্ছে truth is not only found in dates and facts but in memory, experiences and imagination. Woolf does not separate history and fiction. Jane Digge explains Woolf uses fictional history to write history, uses fictional techniques to write history, and Woolf uses history to deepen fiction. Truth is not only found in dates and facts but in memory, experience and imagination. Woolf does not separate history and fiction. Jane Digge explains Woolf uses fictional techniques to write history and history to deepen fiction. Truth is not only found in dates and facts but in memory, experiences and imagination. Point number 5, memory. How the past stays alive. Woolf believes the past is never dead. It constantly shapes the present. Jane Digge shows how Woolf uses personal memory, reading, plays, stories to bring the past into present moment. For Woolf, reading history makes it feel alive. Family homes connect centuries and memory blends personal and national history. This means history is not distant, it is something we live with. Okay. Woolf believes the past is never dead. Never dead. It constantly shapes the present. Jane Digge shows how Woolf uses personal memory, reading, plays, stories to bring the past into the present moment. For Woolf, reading history makes it feel alive. Family homes connect centuries. Memory blends personal and national history. This means history is not distant. It is something we live with. Woolf believes the past is never dead. It constantly shapes the present. Past is never dead. It constantly shapes the present. Jane Digge shows how Woolf uses personal memory, reading places, stories to bring the past into the present moment. For Woolf, reading history makes it feel alive. Family homes connect centuries, and memory blends personal and national history. Memory blends personal and national history. This means history is not distant, it is something we live with. Point number 6, feminism and memory. পেট্রিয়ার্কাল হিস্ট্রি, এই পয়েন্টগুলো কিন্তু খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট, এবং 3 Guineas দিও এটাই যে পড়াশোনা, এডুকেশন, profession, war, এটাই বলছে that past is never dead, it constantly shapes the present. Coming right back. ওকে, পয়েন্ট নাম্বার 6 হচ্ছে ফেমিনিজম অ্যান্ড মেমোরি। পেট্রিয়ার্কাল হিস্ট্রি ইরেজড উইমেন। সো উলফ বিশ্বাস করে women must recover lost histories. She has this desire to understand the present leads women to search the past. Jane Digge explains Woolf connects so-called objective history with bodily experience and emotion. This is feminist. Because women's lives were emotional, domestic, invisible. Woolf insists these lives matter historically. For example, Judith Shakespeare from A Room of One's Own represents women erased from history, waiting to be revived. Right? পেট্রিয়ার্কি সবসময় মেয়েদেরকে মেমোরির থেকে মুছে ফেলেছে, হিস্ট্রি থেকে মুছে ফেলেছে। তো উলফ বিশ্বাস করে যে মেয়েদের ওই লস্ট হিস্ট্রিগুলো রিকভার করাটা খুব দরকার। দে শুড হ্যাভ দিস ডিজায়ার, উইমেন শুড নো দ্যাট ডিজায়ার টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড দ্য প্রেজেন্ট। এখন তোমায় বোঝার জন্য পাস্টটা বুঝতে হবে, and women should look up their past, search their past. Woolf connects so-called objective history with bodily experiences and emotion. Bodily experiences and emotion. This is feminist because women's lives are emotional, invisible, and domestic. Woolf insists these lives matter historically. For example, Judith Shakespeare from A Room of One's Own represents women erased from history, waiting to be revived. So patriarchal history erased women, so Woolf believes women must recover lost histories. Desire to understand the present must lead to the search of the past. Jane Digge explains Woolf connects so-called objective history with bodily experiences and emotion. This is feminist because women's lives are emotional, domestic, and invisible. Woolf insists these lives matter historically. Women's lives were emotional, domestic, and invisible. Woolf insists these lives matter historically. Example, Judith Shakespeare from A Room of One's Own represents women erased from history, waiting to be revived. Point number 7, biography as feminist history. Woolf prefers biography to traditional history. Keano? Biography deals with private life. History deals with public institutions. Public institutions excluded women. Jane Digge shows that in the 3 Guineas in 3 Guineas, Virginia Woolf uses biographies of real women, letters, diaries, memoirs, not to collect data, but to let women from the past speak again. Her library becomes a living space where women's voices survive. Woolf prefers biography to traditional history. Why? Because biography deals with private life, history deals with public institutions. Public institutions excluded women. Guinea shows that in Three Guineas, Woolf uses biographies of real women, diaries, letters, memoirs, not to collect data but to let women from the past speak again. Her library becomes a living space where women's voices survive. Point number 8, examples of women's lives in Three Guineas. Jane Digge explains Woolf's method in detail. Point number 1, Mary Kingsley. Educated, who we are all talking about real women, যাদের বায়োগ্রাফি নিয়ে থ্রি গিনিজ তৈরি হয়েছে, যাদেরকে নিয়ে ভার্জিনিয়া কাজ করছে, তাদেরকে আমরা একবার চট করে পড়ে নেব। So first is Mary Kingsley. Who is Mary Kingsley? Educated only through private sacrifice, represents generations of educated men's daughters. Woolf summons her as a witness, not just a quotation. This shows the past still speaks to the present. Mary Kingsley পড়াশোনা করেছে only through private sacrifice. বাইরে গিয়ে লেখাপড়া করতে পারেনি, ঘরে যতদূর সম্ভব। ও রিপ্রেজেন্ট করছে generations of educated লোকেদের মেয়ে। Woolf summons her as a witness, not just a quotation. This shows the past still speaks to the present. Point number 2 is Arthur's Education Fund. Woolf connects Thackeray's fiction, family history, real financial practices. She shows families invested in sons, daughters paid the cost. This pattern existed from medieval times to Woolf's present, and we are safe to hear econo. So, there has been no real progress. Third, hoche Sophia Jex Blake. Woolf dramatizes her fight to study medicine. Jane Digge shows Woolf turns letters into dialogue, turns history into scenes, shows fathers opposing daughters. Woolf ends by showing men in 1938 still sing the same song, patriarchy repeating itself. And fourth number point, searching in the dark. Woolf admits there are very few biographies of professional women. She gropes in the dark, finds governesses like Nellie Wheaton, gradually uncovers women like Anne Clow, Josephine Butler, Gertrude Bell. This method shows women's history must be reconstructed collectively. Individually, তেমনটা নেই। ঠিক আছে, তো এই পার্টটা ভীষণ ইম্পর্টেন্ট, প্লিজ স্টাডি again. Mary Kingsley is someone who educated only through private sacrifice. এটা একটু এখান থেকে পড়ব। Who was Mary Kingsley in Three Guineas? In real life, Mary Kingsley exist করতো, 1862 তে জন্ম, 1900 এ মারা গেছে, was a British explorer, writer and anthropologist. She traveled alone in West Africa. She was highly intelligent and capable. She had no formal education. She spent most of her youth nursing sick parents, running the household, sacrificing her own opportunities. She educated herself at home secretly in scraps of time. Why does Woolf bring Mary Kingsley into Three Guineas? In Three Guineas, Woolf uses Mary Kingsley to prove one central point. Women's achievements were possible despite patriarchy, not because of it. Mary Kingsley becomes evidence of wasted female talent, unpaid female labor, unequal education, silent sacrifice. She represents daughters of educated men. Woolf groups women like Mary Kingsley under one category. The daughters of educated men, meaning their fathers were educated, their brothers went to school, they themselves were denied education, they funded male success through sacrifice. Mary Kingsley's life fits this pattern exactly. She proves the injustice of education system. Woolf points out the irony. Mary Kingsley became a respected intellectual, yet She never went to university, never received formal training. Her knowledge came after years of domestic imprisonment. This allows Woolf to argue the education system did not create genius, it actively blocked it. পড়াশোনার জায়গা জিনিয়াস তৈরি করে না, অ্যাক্টিভলি আটকে দেয়। যে মেয়েদের লেখাপড়া করা দরকার, উচিত, তাদেরকে করতে দেয় না। সবার করা উচিত। She exposes the myth of natural female inferiority. Patriarchy কি claim করছে? That women are less capable, women lack intellect, women belong at home. Mary Kingsley's life destroys this myth. Woolf uses her to show women's inferiority is produced by denial, not biological essentialism. If given freedom, women excel. She supports Woolf's argument about unpaid labor. Woolf stresses that women paid for men's education with their time, sacrificed careers to support families, worked without recognition or salary. Mary Kingsley spent years caring for parents, delayed her own life until it was too late, and only traveled and wrote after her duties ended. So Woolf treated her historical evidence, treats her as historical evidence of female exploitation. Mary Kingsley is not used sentimentally, she's not romanticized, she's not praised as an exceptional woman. That's important. Woolf does not say, look, a rare great woman. She says, look how many were suppressed. Okay. What is Arthur's Education Fund? Arthur's Education Fund is not a real fund, okay? It is a conceptual name Woolf invents to explain a real social practice. Key practice ta? It explains the family's money, time and energy were invested in educating sons. And a common name was Arthur, right? While daughters silently paid the cost by giving up their own education and freedom. এক সেকেন্ড গাইস। হ্যাঁ, so Arthur was a very common name, right? So while daughters silently paid the cost by giving up on their own education and freedom, right? Thackeray's fiction. Woolf borrows the name Arthur from William Makepeace Thackeray's novels. Thackeray's world e ki hocche? Thackeray, Arthur is a respectable, educated son. He goes to school, university, he has a public life. His education is treated as normal and deserved. Woolf uses this familiar fictional figure to say literature normalized the idea that sons must be educated at any cost. So fiction reflects and reinforces social practice. Karon fiction to tai boleche je Arthur to porashona korbei. It's very normal and natural. So fiction actually reflect korche and reinforce korche social practice guloke. Point number 2, family history. Woolf then shifts from fiction to real family life. She points out that in real Victorian/Edwardian families, there were limited money. Educating sons were expensive. Someone had to sacrifice. That someone was daughters, sisters, mothers. They stayed at home, gave up schooling, did domestic labor, supported fathers and brothers. So Woolf says, in effect, Arthur's education was paid by his sister's deprivation. And real financial practice, now Woolf makes the argument material, not emotional. She shows that education costs money. Families made financial choices. These choices were gendered. Money went to books for son, travel for son, tutors for son, degrees for son. What daughters got was scraps of learning, a little German, a little music, no professional training. So Arthur's Education Fund is fictional in name, real in practice, economic and consequences. So what daughters got? Scrapes of learning, a little German, a little music, no professional training. She's not blaming individual fathers or brothers. She's saying the system assumed sons mattered more. Families simply obeyed that system. Women paid the invisible cost. Right, which is very true. And lastly we have Sophia Jex-Blake. আমি আলাদা করে তোমাদের এটাই পড়ালাম এই জন্য যাতে আমার নিজেরও মনে থাকে। ম্যারি কিংসলি, who was Sophia Jex-Blake, born in 1840, died in 1912, one of the first women to study medicine in Britain, a leader of the Edinburgh Seven, okay, women who fought to study medicine, faced violent opposition, legal obstruction, public ridicule, eventually became a qualified doctor, later helped found medical schools for women. She is a real historical figure and not fictional. Why does Woolf use Sophia Jex-Blake in Three Guineas? Patriarchy repeats the same argument against women across generations, even when times appear to have progressed. Jex-Blake becomes evidence of repetition. যে women তখনও excluded হবে, এখনো হবে. Not just struggle. How Woolf uses Sophia Jex-Blake? She represents women. Sophia Jex-Blake হচ্ছে প্রফেশনে আসছে, ম্যারি কিংসলি এডুকেশনে যাচ্ছিল, ঠিক আছে? She represents women entering professions. Jex-Blake appears in part 2 where Woolf discusses women entering professions, resistance from institutions, masculine fear of losing authority. Medicine is important because it is respected, scientific, objective profession. Denial here cannot be blamed on emotion or tradition alone. Woolf does not summarize Jex-Blake abstractly. She quotes her letters, dramatizes her struggle, shows the tone of male opposition. Men argue that women are biologically unfit. Education ওদের ক্ষতি করবে, ঠিক আছে? Tradition রক্ষা করা দরকার আছে. Woolf's point is devastating. The same excuses are still being used in Woolf's নিজস্ব সময়. She exposes the myth of progress. This is the key reason Jex-Blake matters. Woolf compares arguments used against Jex-Blake in 19th century, arguments used against women in 1938. They are almost identical. মানে 19th century তে যেটা ইউজ হচ্ছে 20th century তেও সেটা ইউজ হচ্ছে. So Woolf concludes history has not moved forward in any meaningful way for women. She proves exclusion is institutional, not personal. Woolf uses Jex-Blake to show the problem is not a few bad men. The problem is institutions, universities, medical boards, professional gatekeeping. Even when a woman is intelligent, determined, and disciplined, she is blocked. Why Sophia Jex symbolizes what? She symbolizes women's struggle for professional legitimacy, resistance to institutional patriarchy, the cost of breaking barriers, the illusion of historical progress. She is paired conceptually with Mary Kingsley, education denied, Arthur's education fund, financial sacrifice, women professionals, ethical dangers of imitation. Woolf is not writing a heroic biography. She is not praising individual greatness. She is not claiming victory. Instead, she is saying even when women win, the societies or the systems remain hostile. This was very much required for you all to understand and for me to understand. Me, especially me. Still the same song, women are biologically unfit, ক্ষতি হয়ে যাবে, professionally এলে, blah 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 blah. তো এই ড্যাশ ড্যাশ গুলোই বকে যাচ্ছে সোসাইটি, সময় বদলাচ্ছে, সোসাইটি বদলাচ্ছে না. সো ফার্স্ট হচ্ছে ম্যারি কিংসলি, এটা হাইলাইট করতে হবে আমাকে. Educated only through private sacrifice, represents generations of educated men's daughters. Woolf summons her as a witness, not just a quotation. This shows the past still speaks to the present. Arthur's education fund. Woolf connects Thackeray's fiction, Arthur, family history, real financial practices. She shows families invested in sons, daughters paid the cost. This pattern existed from medieval times to Woolf's time. So there has been no real progress. Sophia Jex Blake, Woolf dramatizes her fight to study medicine. Jane Digge shows Woolf turns her letters into dialogue, turns history into scenes, shows fathers opposing daughters. Woolf ends by showing men in 1938 still sing the same song, patriarchy repeats itself. She had to literally search in the dark. Woolf admits there are very few biographies of professional women. She gropes in the darkness, finds governesses like Nellie Beaton, gradually uncovers women. Sophia Jex Blake, oikhane hocche Mary Kingsley. Sophia Jex Blake. Anne Clark, Josephine Butler, Gertrude Bell. This method shows women's histories must be reconstructed collectively. কিছু একটা হয়ে যাচ্ছে, I have no idea. Oh, চলে গেছে.
She gropes in the darkness, finds governesses like Nellie Wheaton, gradually uncovers women like and Clough, Josephine Butler, Gertrude Bell. This method shows women's history must be reconstructed collectively. 9. Collective memory of
I have nothing to do. Yes. এই পার্টটা একটু বুঝবো. In 3 Guineas, Woolf admit করছে that women's history is difficult to recover because it was never properly recorded. She therefore gropes in the darkness, beginning with obscure figures such as governesses like Nellie Wheaton and gradually uncovering women such as Anne Clark, Josephine Butler and Gertrude Bell, showing that women's history cannot be written through isolated heroes but must be reconstructed collectively from scattered lives. When you say that women's history cannot be written through isolated heroes but must be reconstructed collectively from scattered lives, what does it mean? Traditional history is written like this: একটা বড় লোক, একটা heroic life, one clear achievement, one public record, spectacle. For example, a king, a general, a scientist, a political leader. This works because men had access to education, right? Men held public positions. Men left records, boy, law, letter, statues. So history can say, oh, this man did a great thing. Why this model does not work for women? Woolf points out that women were excluded from political institutions. They did not hold official positions, rarely published books, rarely had biographies written about them, often lives interrupted life. কখনো বিয়ে হয়ে গেল, কখনো কেয়ার নিচ্ছে অন্য কারোর, তো কখনো পভার্টিতে চলে গেছে. So women's lives look like fragments, interruptions, silences, private struggles. That means there are very few heroic female figures in the historical record, not because women lacked ability but because the system erased them. When Woolf says she's groping in the darkness, she means there is no clear historical path, no complete archive, no grand narrative, only partial traces. So she finds a governess's diary like Nellie Wheaton, a letter, a footnote, a forgotten name. Each by itself looks small and insignificant. Why isolated heroes would be misleading? If Woolf wrote history by choosing only Sophia Jex Blake or Mary Kingsley or Gertrude Bell, it would suggest exceptional women succeed. That would be dangerous because it implies other women failed due to lack of talent, reinforcing the patriarchal idea. The system was very fair, they just did not deserve it and only the best rose. Woolf rejects this idea completely. What reconstructed collectively means, instead of one heroic story, Woolf places many women side by side, shows shared conditions, shows repeated obstacles, shows similar sacrifices. When you put these lives together, a pattern emerges: lack of education, financial dependence, social control, delayed achievement. No single life tells the whole story. Together, they reveal systematic oppression and why this is feminist and radical. This method says women matter not because a few were extraordinary, but because all of them lived under the same injustice. It shifts history from greatness to structure, from achievement to condition, to heroic to system. That is why Woolf's method is called feminist historiography. So her Woolf's method is called feminist historiography because she is not painting a few exceptional heroic women, because if she would do that, she would be reinforcing the patriarchal mode of historiography, right? That, you know, the survival of the fittest, the best rose, the exceptional women rose, and the system was fair. It was clearly not, because women did not even get the chance to prove themselves, and the one who rose were the one who, you know, got their achievement first very late. It was delayed for them. They had to fight against the systematic oppression, and they were still a bit privileged than the other women because they could at least fight it, because the others, they lacked even their voices. They were hidden inside the wheels, and the system did not even exist for them. There was no system for them. It was fair or unfair is a later question. The entire system was absent to them. Women were excluded from everywhere. Like, if it was fair, it would have given all the women the chances of education that it gave to its men, but it did not. And the ones who fought for it, cried for it, howled for it, begged for it, only they got. And others were forever in the darkness. And hence she is reclaiming history by saying that no, it does not reside with the great men. It has no universal story, no isolated heroes, because women were reconstruct collectively. All of them fought the same system. Let me see if I got it correct. Okay. We are acing it, guys. Point number 9. Collective memory of women. Woolf groups women's lives together. She shows they were educated by poverty, chastity, mockery, independence from false loyalties. This creates a shared female historical experience. This shared memory explains why women see war differently, why they resist power differently. কারণ এটাই তো ওদের লাইফে হয়ে এসছে। ওদের যুদ্ধক্ষেত্রে তো যাওয়ার দরকার নেই যুদ্ধকে রেজিস্ট করার জন্য। ওরা দূর থেকে দেখে বলে দেবে যে যুদ্ধ কেন ঠিক নয় এবং যুদ্ধ এড়াতে কি করতে হবে, বিকজ তাদের লাইফে তো এটা হচ্ছে। Woolf shows women's lives together. She shows that they were educated by poverty, chastity, mockery, independence from false loyalty, যে যারা জাস্ট ওদের ইউজ করতে চাইছে ওখান থেকে স্বাধীনতা পাচ্ছে। This creates a shared female historical experience. This shared memory explains why women see war differently and why they resist power differently. আমি তাও এটা আরেকটু ডিটেইলে পড়তে চাই। ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট। Okay. Woolf groups women's lives together. Woolf does not treat women as isolated individuals, separate success stories, exceptional cases. Instead, she places women side by side to show what repetitive conditions, shared constraints, and common training in women gulo tara peche. Repeating conditions Same training, common training, shared constraints, repeating conditions, shared constraints, and similar training. Common. Repeating conditions, shared constraints, and common training. Her point is women were shaped less by choice and more by the same social pressures. Educated by poverty, what this means? This does not mean women were always poor. It means women rarely inherited taka paisa. They lacked independent income. Education for them was underfunded or denied. Because of this, women learned to live with limits. They understood scarcity. They learned the real cost of power. This kind of education shikhaye caution, not conquest, survival, not dominance. Educated by chastity, not morality, but control. Chastity এখানে হচ্ছে regulation of women's bodies, constant social surveillance, fear of scandal. Women were trained to restrain desire, avoid visibility, protect reputation. This produced inward discipline, self-monitoring, aware of how power polices body. Woolf shows control of women's bodies mirrors control of nations. এই যেটা তো ওদের সাথে এমনি হয়ে যায়, তুমি এভাবে ড্রেস করবে না, ওভাবে ড্রেস করবে না, তোমার স্কিন যাতে দেখা না যায়। Control of nations, right? Educated by mockery. Women who tried to step outside roles were laughed at, dismissed, ridiculed, trivialized. Mockery taught women not to trust praise, not to seek public approval, not to confuse applause with value. This made women suspicious of honor. যে আমি কি সত্যি এটা ডিজার্ভ করি? Resistant to spectacle. আমাকে নিয়ে যাতে লোক হাসাহাসি না করে। Wary of mass enthusiasm. বাবা এরা এত এক্সাইটেড হচ্ছে কেন? An education by independence from false loyalties. False loyalties include blind nationalism, unquestioned obedience to institutions, loyalty to systems that exclude you. Since women are excluded from the state, marginalized by institutions, they learned emotional distance, ethical independence, skepticism toward authority. This is crucial. So, putting these together, these conditions create women who are less inverted in power, less attracted to domination, more aware of suffering, and more alert to injustice. This is collective. ठीक को लगा please. Women were so they are less invested in power, less attracted to domination, more aware of suffering, and more alert to injustice. This is collective, not personal. It is not women are naturally peaceful. It is women were historically trained differently. And why this makes women see war differently? Because women did not benefit from nation state. Candles are not here. Close the door properly. Because women did not benefit from the nation state, were excluded from its rewards, paid its cost still, like death, poverty, care. War does not look like glory, honor, patriotism to them. It looks like loss, waste, cruelty. So women respond with refusal, skepticism, moral decision. And why this makes women resist power differently? Women do not resist by taking control, replacing rulers, seizing authority. They resist by refusal, withdrawal, ethical independence, outsiderhood. This is why Woolf's resistance is quiet, non-heroic, collective, anti-authoritarian. Change korte chai by controlling na, change korte chai by refusing, skepticism. Okay, so because women did not benefit from the nation state, they were excluded from its rewards, paid its cost. War does not look like glory, honor, patriotism to them. It looks like loss, waste, cruelty. Loss, waste, cruelty. So women respond with refusal, skepticism, moral distance. Okay. Poverty, chastity, mockery, independence from false loyalties. A shared female historical experience. This shared memory explain kore why women see war differently, why they resist power differently. Point number 10, and we are almost done. Almost. কতক্ষণ ধরে পড়ছি আমরা? This is taking a long time. It's okay. Connecting past and present violence. Woolf uses photographs. কেন Woolf ছবি ইউজ করছে at all? Woolf includes photographs from the Spanish Civil War, images of ruined houses, injured or dead bodies, civilian suffering. These are not decoration, these are deliberate evidence. These are what? Deliberate evidence. In Three Guineas, Woolf uses photographs from Spanish Civil War not to make a logical argument but to provoke an immediate emotional response that activates historical memory. Through this emotional recognition, she connects ancient patriarchal authority figures such as Creon. এরকম করে পড়লে হবে না, আমাকে একটু বড় করে পড়তে হবে because I love to do that. Woolf includes photographs from the Spanish Civil War, images of ruined houses, injured or dead bodies, civilian suffering. These are not just decoration, they are deliberate evidence. But Woolf immediately says something important. Photographs are not arguments, meaning they do not explain causes, they do not prove theories, they do not persuade through logic. She is not using them like a historian or journalist would. Eta amar argument, ei hocche ta proof. Photographs kono cause explain করে না, photographs kono theory prove করে না, photographs মানে লজিকের মতো কিছু persuade করতে পারে না লজিক দিয়ে। তাহলে কেন ইউজ করছে photographs? Because photographs do something logic cannot. Woolf says, when you see these images, you feel shock, horror, disgust. That feeling happens instantly. Good bacha amar. Before analysis, before debate. A feeling gulo chot kore hoy before you can debate about it or analyze it. And crucially, a emotion gulo memory ke trigger kore deয়. The photograph does not argue. It awakens key recognition. What kind of memory is triggered? Not just personal memory but historical memory. Oh, Spanish war eto kharap hoychilo. Jane Digge explains that Woolf uses photographs to make readers feel, I have seen this before. Not literally but structurally. The suffering in Spain feels connected to earlier wars, older tyrannies, ancient authority figures. This is how Woolf collapses present and past. Present and past কে কিভাবে Woolf collapse করে দিচ্ছে? ছবিটা যখন আজকে আমি দেখবো, আমি তো স্প্যানিশ সিভিল ওয়ার দেখিনি, কিন্তু আমি কি দেখেছি? সিপয় অফ 1857 পড়েছি অ্যাটলিস্ট, বা চোখের সামনে ইসরায়েল প্যালেস্তাইনের ওয়ার দেখছি। তো এইগুলো সব পুরনো ওয়ার, পুরনো টাইরানি, পুরনো মৃত্যু আমার জন্য এনে দিচ্ছে মেমোরি। ইটস এ ডেলিবারেট এভিডেন্স, ওকে, আর্লিয়ার ওয়ার্স, এন্ড দিস ইজ হাউ পাস্ট এন্ড প্রেজেন্ট কোলাপস করে যাচ্ছে। How Woolf aligns ancient patriarchy with modern fascism. একবার ইমোশন ট্রিগার হয়ে গেলে Woolf এবার একটা হিস্টোরিক্যাল মুভ করছে। She shows that the psychology behind violence is always the same, even if the era changes. আমি হয়তো স্প্যানিশ সিভিল ওয়ার চিনতে পারছি না, কিন্তু ছবিটা দেখে অন্য যুদ্ধের কথা আমি ঠিক মনে পড়ে যাচ্ছে। তো একই ইমোশন আমার ট্রিগার করছে, যেটা মেবি যে স্প্যানিশ সিভিল ওয়ার চিনবে তার করছে। কেন করছে? কারণ দ্য রিজন বিহাইন্ড এই ওয়ারগুলো সেম আছে, যদিও টাইমটা বদলে গেছে। Jane Digge points out that Woolf aligns Creon, a rigid authority state law over human life, Paul the Apostle, religious authority, used to silence women, I'm so sorry, Victorian fathers, domestic patriarchy, obedience in the home থাকবে, like Thomas A. কি নাম লোকটা? I'm not talking about Cromwell, not Thomas Cromwell or opponent. Victorian fathers, domestic patriarchy, obedience in the home, fascist dictators, absolute power, uniform strength, nationalism, war. These figures belong to different centuries, but Woolf insists they all operate with the same mindset. That's literally the easiest part. And what is that same psychology? Across all these figures, Woolf identifies obsession with authority, fear of disobedience, need for control, belief in hierarchy, punishment of dissent. This psychology appears in the state, in the religion, in the family, in fascist regimes. In the state, in the religion, in the family, in fascist regimes. So Woolf's claim is fascism is not new. It is patriarchy grown violent. Beautiful, Virginia. Jane Digge points out that Woolf aligns with Creon, Paul the Apostle, Victorian fathers, and fascist dictators. They all operate with the same mindset. And what is that same psychology? They are obsessed with authority. They want to, they love domination. They fear disobedience, and they believe in hierarchy, punishment of dissent. They have this need for control. Oh, এটা উপরে ওঠানো যায়। Nice. তাই আমার মাথার জন্য এটা অনেক উপরে। Yeah, this is so relaxing. This psychology appears in the state, in the religion, in the family, and in fascist regimes. So Woolf's claim is fascism is not new, it is patriarchy grown violent. Why photographs are essential to this argument? If Woolf had argued this logically, readers could debate it. Logically যদি Woolf বুঝাতে যেত এটা, রিডাররা ডিবেট করতো, নাও তুমি এটা ভুল বলছো, কিন্তু ফটোগ্রাফ কি করে আর্গুমেন্টটাকে স্টপ করে দেয়, একটা শেয়ার্ড ইমোশন প্রডিউস করে, ইডিওলজি বাইপাস করে যায়। দ্যাট ইমোশনাল শক allows Woolf to say what you are seeing in Spain is not exceptional. It is the visible outcome of a very old system. If Woolf had argued this logically, readers could debate it. But photographs stop argument, produce shared opinion or emotions, and bypass ideology. Stop argument, produce shared emotion, and bypass ideology. What you are seeing in Spain is not exceptional. It is the visible outcome of a very, very old system. And the key insight, Woolf uses emotion from photographs to activate memory, which reveals historical repetition, evolution. So photographs reveal, emotions from memory, from photographs activate memory, which reveals historical repetition. Jane Digge's point is Woolf's feminist historiography works by showing that patriarchy repeats itself across time, and modern fascism is simply its latest form. সবাই বদলালে ফর্মটা বদলে যাবে। Point number 11, psychology and infantile fixation. মানে Woolf সব কথাই বলে গেছে। Just like you did, you gave 8 points for this one, right? Why Woolf uses photograph. Do it similarly with this also. Female historiography, তাহলে women side by side, past and present, photographs. Why Woolf uses psychology to explain patriarchy? Why Woolf turns to psychology at all? কেন psychology দরকার? Virginia Woolf wants to explain why oppression persists even when it is irrational, it is cruel and destructive. Politics and law alone cannot explain this. So she looks at human psychology. Authority as emotional dependence. Woolf argues that many men cling to authority like children cling to toys. কেন? Because power becomes emotionally comforting. এটা খেলনা পেলে বাচ্চা যেমনি খুশি হয়ে যায়, ছেলেরাও তাই পাওয়ার পেলে খুশি হয়ে যায়। and it is not ethically justified. কোনো জাস্টিফিকেশন হয় না. At the root of patriarchy is ভয়, fear of equality. মেয়েটাও কি আমার মতো হয়ে যাবে? Fear of disobedience. আমি ঘরের মালিক, মাথা, কর্তা, তো আমার মেয়েও কি এবার থেকে আমার মতোই হয়ে যাবে? So fear of losing dominance. আমার হাতে কি আর পাওয়ার থাকবে না? And authority is used to soothe this fear. আরে আমার হাতে অথরিটি আছে, তুই চিন্তা করছিস কেন? ঠিক আছে. Although patriarchy itself is rational and orderly, although patriarchy presents itself as rational and orderly, Woolf shows that it actually operates through emotion, insecurity, pride, anger, and fear. In family, fathers enforce obedience not through logic but through emotional authority, tradition, threat, and control over dependence. Application to churches. লোকটার নাম ছিল অ্যাপোস্টল, প্রথম একটা ক্রিয়ন, Paul the Apostle. Religious institutions silence women by appealing to emotional obedience and sacred authority, not reasoned moral equality. তুমি চুপ থাকবে কারণ তুমি ওখানে বিলং করো না, because moral, sacred authority, Jesus চাইতো ওটা, ভগবান চাইতো ওটা, চার্চ বলছি, তাই ক্যান সে জিসাস, ইয়া. Religious institutions silence women by appealing to emotional obedience and sacred authority. Emotional obedience কাছে appeal করে and sacred authority কাছে appeal করে, not reasoned moral equality. Point number 7, application to state and fascist leaders. The same emotional need for control appears in governments and fascist regimes, where leaders demand loyalty, punish dissent, and glorify authority. So by tracing the same psychology from the household to the state, Woolf proves that oppression is driven by emotional insecurity, not rational necessity, and that patriarchy and fascism share the same psychological roots. So by tracing the same psychology from the household to the state, Woolf proves that oppression is driven by emotional insecurity, not rational necessity, and that patriarchy and fascism share the exact same psychological roots. Religion and history. Jane Digge explains Woolf's critique of religion. Church history excluded women. St. Paul's writings silenced female disciples. Modern church continues this exclusion. Woolf contrasts this with ancient prophetesses, spiritual women like Emily Bronte. This shows alternative female histories exist beneath patriarchal ones. এটাকে বৃহত্তর ভাবে পড়ার দরকার নেই. It is very clear. জেন ডিগে এক্সপ্লেন করছে Woolf's critique of religion কে, that church history excluded women. St. Paul's writings silenced female disciples. Modern church continued this exclusion. Woolf contrasts this with ancient prophetesses, spiritual women like Emily Bronte. This shows alternative female histories do exist. They only exist beneath the patriarchal ones. 13th, point number 13th is progress narratives exposed. Woolf tests feminist progress stories and rejects them. Examples: women colleges, women in World War I, early feminist movements. She shows gains were partial, power structures একই থেকে গেছিল. Women entered public life only to serve war. Therefore, women are safer remaining outsiders. Woolf tests feminist, এই যে feminist progress এগুলোও কতটা সত্যি কতটা মিথ্যে ও সেগুলোও টেস্ট করলো এবং ওগুলোকে মুখের ওপর রিজেক্ট করলো. এক্সাম্পল, উইমেন কলেজ তৈরি হলো, সেই একই পড়াশোনা পড়ানোর জন্য যেগুলো ছেলেদের পড়িয়ে ওরা ঢুকানো হচ্ছে, ঠিক আছে, যেগুলো দিয়ে ক্যাপিটালিস্ট সিস্টেম এগোচ্ছে, ফেসিস সিস্টেমটা এগিয়ে চলেছে, অথরিটি, ডমিনেশন, হাইরার্কি, ইউনিফর্মিটি, হোয়াট এলস, উইমেন ইন ওয়ার্ল্ড ওয়ার ওয়ান জাস্ট যুদ্ধের জন্য নিয়ে যাওয়া হচ্ছে, আর্লি ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্ট. শি শোজ দ্যাট আর্লি ফেমিনিস্ট মুভমেন্ট থেকে যে গেইনগুলো হচ্ছে দে আর ভেরি পার্শিয়াল, ফুল হোল হার্টেড গেইন কিচ্ছু আসেনি, and power structures remained the same, ঠিক আছে. And women on top of that entered public life only to serve war. Therefore, women are safer remaining outsiders. Point number 14, the outsider society. Woolf's solution ki men work publicly for peace. Women work privately as outsiders. Jane Digge explain করছে that this is not a weakness but strategy. Women must stay outside institutions, refuse power and preserve ethical independence. Woolfের solution কি দিচ্ছে? ভার্জিনিয়া উলফ বলছে ছেলেদের কাজ করা উচিত ফর পিস এন্ড মেয়েদের বাইরে থেকে কাজ করা উচিত। ঠিক আছে, এটা কোনো উইকনেস নয়। Women must stay outside institutions, refusing power and working for ethical independence. Working na preserving নিজেদের ethical independence. Women that men must work publicly for peace, women work privately as outsiders, and Jane Digge explains this is not weakness but strategy. Women must stay outside institutions, refuse power, and preserve ethical independence. And the last point number 15. So Jane Digge concludes Three Guineas does not just write history, it participates in history. Mary Kingsley, Sophia Jex Blake participates in history. It rewrites the past to change the future. Woolf reclaims কিভাবে? Woolf reclaim women's history, links sexism, fascism and war, creates a feminist historical method. এটা আমি আরেকটা জিনিস করে বন্ধ করে দেবো, and we are done with today's video. It rewrites the past to change the future. Women were not educated by institutions বা পড়াশোনার system, but by chastity, mockery, poverty, and independence from blind loyalties, false loyalties. Changing education, power relations, and obedience itself. Preventing war requires changing education, power relations, and obedience itself. Changing education, power relations, and obedience itself. Changing education, power relation, and blah blah blah. Obedience itself. Changing education, power relations, and education itself. So now that you know we are talking about Gay, the writer of this article, write in points, short bullet points, no with no explanations, about female historiographical method of Woolf. I got everything, just write this part. Treats memory as historical evidence, just in short give me that explanation for that. And uses emotion as historical insight and reads history ethically, not triumphantly. Just these three. Okay. Woolf reads history in terms of suffering, exclusion, and moral cost rather than black and white, victory or progress, judging the past by its human consequences. Judging the past by its human consequences instead of its achievements. And with this, we are done with this article.